You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Okay, well, guess who we have for you here today? Kristina McMorris, New York Times best-selling author of Sold on a Monday. She's also a USA Today best-selling author. She's been published by Sourcebooks Landmark, Kensington, HarperCollins, and Penguin Random House. Her novels have been inspired by true historical and personal accounts, beginning with her grandparents' World War II courtship letters. How sweet is that? They have garnered more than 24 prestigious awards and nominations, including Impact Dublin Literary Award, RWA Rita Award, Goodreads Choice Historical Fiction Award. This book that we love, that we're here to talk to her about today, Sold on a Monday, is hitting 1 million copies sold. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It is a New York Times bestseller, USA Today bestseller, Publishers Weekly. The author, Pam Jenoff, New York Times bestselling author of Orphan Tale, says this book is brilliantly chronicles the way in which a moment's fateful choice can result in a lifetime of harrowing consequences. She says it's a masterpiece that poignantly echoes universal themes of loss and redemption. Publishers Weekly says this book is giving readers a story with grit, substance, and rich historical detail. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Kristina, some fun facts. Prior to her writing career, she was a PR director and host of weekly television shows, starting with an Emmy Award at the age of 9. Just fantastic. She also owned a wedding and event planning company until she had enough and her fill of the YMCA routines and the drunken chicken dances. And we've all seen plenty of those at weddings, haven't we? She was named Portland's 40 Under 40 by the Business Journal, and Kristina lives with her husband and 2 sons in Oregon. Thank you for joining us, Kristina. We adore your book.
Oh, thank you so much. My gosh, that was an amazing intro. I think we filled the whole podcast.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. But you know what? I love to tell our readers about these authors because you have made such amazing accomplishments, and even your backstory is so fun for authors who follow you to learn a little bit more about you. So it's a real treasure.
Absolutely. Well, Kristina, we like to give our listeners just a very brief background on the book. So if you'll indulge me for a second, without giving away any spoilers, of course, I thought I would just tell everybody a little bit about the book. Sold on a Monday is a historical novel, and it's set against the backdrop of the Great Depression in the United States. In the book, Ellis Reed is an ambitious reporter. He works for the Philadelphia Examiner, and while on assignment, he snaps a picture of 2 young boys that are sitting on a porch. He doesn't realize it, but there is a sign next to them that says 2 children for sale. This strikes him on a gut level. He doesn't feel, though, that he can do much to help them. These are hard times. But back at the news office, another character in the story, Lily Palmer, sees the photo and sets in motion a chain of events that lead to unimaginable consequences. And much of the book is the story of both Ellis and Lily as they work together to unravel the family story that appear in a photograph, and then also to address some of the choices that they made and those consequences. In all, this is just a sweeping story that touches on love and redemption and sometimes finding our way back home. Now, if you're ready, Christina, to brave the storm, Chris, I'm ready.
I can't wait to talk to her. So our first question is, in this beautiful story, the main character, Ellis, believes in the beginning, and I'm going to quote this, even when life's downright lousy, most kids are still so resilient because, well, I guess they don't know any different. It's like they only realize how unfair their lives are if you tell them. And even then, all they need is the smallest amount of hope. But as the story unfolds, Ellis and the reader finds out that this is only half truth. Because, yeah, children are resilient, but they're also growing, becoming, forming, and a lot of these experiences sometimes leave them with scars that can't be easily healed. You showed us that in your story. And I just feel like as a reader, I can't help but believe that you must have a strong heart for children to write a story like this. Your relatable characters help us understand that harm to a child is quite possibly the worst crime of them all. And I wondered, was this a purposeful in the writing of your story, or did this voice that we hear so profoundly on behalf of all abused children, did that speak to you as well while you were writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, I'm a mom of two boys, as you mentioned earlier. And so because of that, when I came across the photograph that the book was inspired by, of course, as you all know, from in the author's note, it has the real photograph in there. And on my website, if you want to see just the photograph that inspired it, of 4 children that were sitting on a stoop in Chicago, and a mother that is turned away from the camera, seemingly in shame, with a sign that read, "4 children for sale, inquire within." And as a mom myself, that just struck me, of course, because you think, I can understand more so if you were giving up your children for their betterment because you thought they'd live a better life without you for a lot of circumstances, including, the Great Depression, when finances were very, very difficult. But how could you then ask for money in return? And it was a very quick snap judgment. So I will go back to your question, but I want to touch on that too. And that, I think that was part of my purpose in writing it, was that I was just as guilty, of making that snap judgment. How could a mother do this? And I mentioned that to a writer friend at a breakfast when I was thinking about the story idea. And she said very bluntly, "Christina, because they wanted to eat." And I thought, oh my goodness. And she was speaking from her own family's perspective of hardships that her family had gone through. And I thought, you know what, who am I to judge that without knowing sometimes the context changes everything. And I think that we're all very guilty of that, on occasion, probably more often than we like to admit, of a headline and a snippet of a soundbite, and we make a full judgment on people without understanding the context. And sometimes that can change our opinion of everything and that perspective. So that was part of it. And the other part, was about the children. As a mother myself, thinking, how could a mother do this? But then also understanding that what would push me to those circumstances, that maybe that would be understandable if you understood the whole story. And I do think that children just, of course, are the ones that we want to protect the most. It breaks my heart when you see that children are mistreated, or, they're so reliant on everyone around them to survive that yes, that absolutely answer. The short answer is yes, 100%. I will add one thing else that you touched upon, and that is, about what Ellis's take on kids and where that thought came from about they're so resilient and they don't know how badly they're treated or what they're lacking unless you tell them. And I think, until they hit to a certain age, and other kids tell them very often, or other parents and people around them. Where I got that was because I was researching Bridge of Scarlet Leaves, my second book. It involved the Japanese American internment and the fact that there were 200 non-Japanese spouses who lived in the camps voluntarily. And I thought that was an incredible story I'd never heard before. I'm half Japanese. I thought I knew a lot about the internment. I hadn't heard that before. They didn't want to be separated from their spouses and their children. It was illegal in about 31 states at the time to have that interracial marriage. So my kids would be illegal right now, which I'm sure they would think is very cool at this moment. But the thing is, when I went to visit the internment camp called Manzanar in California, I ended up becoming friends with a former internee there. And he was there for a pilgrimage, and he started sharing that. And that is, he was a kid in the camp. And he shared exactly that. I said, well, how was it living here? Did you realize how bad it was? The middle of the desert, the guns and the towers were pointed inward, not out, even though they were told that it was for their own protection. And he said, you know what's funny? He said, as kids, we thought it was like camp. Everybody kind of looked like us. We thought we get to eat with our friends now for the first time instead of our parents. And he said, so we really didn't realize how bad it was until later in life. And I thought that was a fascinating perspective. And that is absolutely something I wanted to infuse in this story as well.
That's very wise what you said there, and I completely agree with it. There is something about children because they have no other foundation of knowing what is normal versus not normal, and they can seem to exist in all sorts of situations. But then you're right. Then all of a sudden they reach a point where they understand this is hurtful to me. I see other things out there and I'm more aware of my surroundings, that life could be different. And I believe your story really wove both of those ideas together so beautifully, really beautifully.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Kristen, I want to go back to something you had just said. The Great Depression had profound effects, first of all, economically on people, but also on families. And you were talking about this idea of, well, I would never do that. I would never make that choice. I think there's some parallels with modern day adoption. And I was wondering what do you think about the role in empathy as we evaluate parents or women in the situation where they're choosing to give up a child? Because I think empathy has to be maybe an overriding approach that we use. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think that's why we write fiction, many of us, because that is a big reason I wrote the story as well, is that especially in today's time when there is so much divisiveness, and the fact that even if you don't agree with someone else, to have empathy for someone else can really help you sit down and have a conversation. And at least if you don't agree, you can at least understand where they're coming from, which is why I write almost every book I do, because you're introduced to characters and then you start peeling away the layers and realize, even if you don't like them at first, and in Sold on a Monday, you don't necessarily like everybody that you meet in the beginning. Clayton is not necessarily a great character in the beginning, but when you start peeling away the layers and you find out why they're acting the way they do, then I think we have a lot more empathy for people. And I do think that translates. That's the beauty, I think, of fiction, and even really well-written nonfiction too, that is like memoirs, I think definitely promote empathy. And I think it's a better way to live. But so I think that, in the story, absolutely, when it comes to motherhood and giving up children, for a lot of reasons that might be really, really understandable. And if we have empathy for that, it helps not, be such a quick judge. But I think there's also not great reasons too, that, there's good and bad, of course. And in the real story behind Sold on a Monday, I thought that I was going to dig into their history of the real photograph and really then have empathy for this family and this mother and why she made the choices she did. Unfortunately, in real life, she had terrible reasons. And so the real story behind it, of course, is that her husband apparently, and I know this because I became friends with two of the children that were in the photograph.
Wow.
One of them before he passed away, and then the other one, she and I went on the Today Show together a couple of years ago and met for the first time because we had been in touch so much over a year span. And what she shared with me, unfortunately, is that she believes that her father was wanted in that county for a crime and left and never came back. Her mother was dating a new guy, and he didn't want her children from a previous marriage. So she gave up all of them, potentially sold all of them, and even just for the amount of $2. And she said she was going to use the money to play bingo. Wow. And she told that to her daughter when she was taken away by a farmer and his wife. So when you find out those kind of stories, you think, okay, not everybody makes good choices. And later in life, she said she didn't regret any of it. The mother told the kids that as well. And so I think that there's that too. I think that there's good and bad choices, but part of why I wrote the story, of course, is that I wanted to give the kids a better mother than they had in real life, in the real life, even though mine are all fictional.
Wow, very powerful. I think as people, as we age, we're always trying to make sense of the choices our parents made, good and bad. And I think that's a very important part of personal growth, is learning to process, learning to make sense of things, and also learning to try to understand your parents. And they don't always make sense, right? We're
No.
parents ourselves, and we don't always make sense.
I love that what you said too, because when we look at that situation, and I'm always a strong believer that to a great extent we are a product of our environment, and it's hard for me to judge someone unless I've walked every single step in their shoes from the minute they were born. How would I be able to look and say I would do anything different? I think I might because I'm sitting from a better position. But if it came down to me, to the choice of it, I try not to be a judge of that. Unless, how you just showed us the other side of the coin, sometimes evil exists, just pure evil, self-centered, and you know in your heart of hearts, you would never resort to that, no matter what. And your story so beautifully took us through many characters' lives with lots of different choices that they had to make along the way, big choices that took them in different directions. And it made the reader think, I wouldn't do that. Well, maybe I would do that. Or I'm not sure what I would do. It was very thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. Thank you.
Now, your story also shows the reader that, and this goes with what we're saying here, the most logically well thought out choices are not always the best for us. There were some heart choices made in the story. Sometimes we need to think with our hearts instead of our minds. In your story, characters faced some dilemmas like these. Would a child be better off raised by affluent parents who can provide the best clothing, food, shelter, and schooling? Or should that child stay with a poor, single mother who really had nothing to offer but perhaps love? And then we come across this situation. Should a single mother during the Depression accept an offer to marry a man because he can provide for her in a way that she and her child needs, or should she hold out and keep searching for true love? And I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer to either of those, but they were a little bit of a maybe even a moral dilemma that showed us everything isn't always black and white. I wondered if this was a theme you were hoping to portray to the reader in your story, of this notion of choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what's interesting about the choices of Lily, the mom in the story, who's a single mom, and the dilemma that she has, and how tempting that would be. And what I think is interesting is, I should say, what's tempting for those who haven't read the story, what's tempting about her being drawn to comfort and security, even if it's not love, but it's a good choice for her son. And I could see where that would be really tempting for most women back then, especially during that time period when there was a lot of stigma for a single mom, that was pretty shameful for a lot of people, depending on the town you lived in, for that matter as well. But I think what's interesting, part of why I decided to write it that way too, is because I kept finding parallels in today's society. And I thought, isn't that interesting how much has changed and how much stays the same? And we're still talking about the same topics, of judgment of women that are single or go back to work, a working mom versus, a stay-at-home dad, and those choices that we still make today. And even if maybe, what I find interesting is even if maybe the shame is not really coming from an outside source as much as within somebody, that you feel like they're looking at you that way, and maybe they're not. And when I was on book tour, I did talk to a number of people. That was amazing after my speeches, and they would come up and give me their own stories. It was a lot of families that had farmed out the kids, that were their grandparents or their uncles, and super sad stories of mothers having to give up their children because they couldn't afford them. Wow. And I think that, what it brought home is that we're still talking about, like I said, the same topics today. Just because it's Great Depression doesn't mean we didn't just go through, especially the last few years, some pretty hard economic times for a lot of people. And I think a lot of those same choices keep coming back. And that's what I love about fiction, especially, but books in general, is that it brings up these topics, especially for book clubs, and podcasts like yours are amazing because it brings up these topics that usually you wouldn't bring up at cocktail parties, that you probably shouldn't very often in today's climate, but it forces you to talk about those topics. And the more that we talk about them, hopefully the more understanding we have, and the more that we can solve those issues and get rid of some of that, the stigma that's attached to a lot of those.
And sometimes we don't even realize that we're reacting or thinking that way until we sit and talk about it, and we say, wait a minute, we're judging incorrectly. We're doing the same thing we did 100 years ago, and are we ever going to change and make a conscious effort to be someone different? And you brought up something that is Kristen's next question, so I'm going to let her take it. But it was this notion of maybe a little bit of guilt, and do we sabotage our own future? We were talking about that before we zoomed you in here today. And Kristen, do you want to go with that?
Yeah, first of all, that topic is one we could probably have many podcasts on, because, as parents, as mothers, we are always wrestling with guilt. And, should I be working? Should this person be caring for the children? I have 4 kids. And, between us, we have a lot of kids at this table and on this podcast. Those universal concerns never go away. I mean, we see them exacerbated by the difficult circumstances, the depression. But as you pointed out, we have difficult circumstances now that are really pressing in on us as parents. Are my kids healthy? Are they learning? Should I be doing more with them? Absolutely.
And the same choices for single parents trying to raise kids in this world where everyone has to work and you're expected to be so many different things. Yeah. We as women have more choices today than the Depression, but as Kristen said, we're still facing a lot of these same dilemmas. Yeah.
Absolutely. And even when you are there, right, as you well know, with double the amount of kids that I have, I can't imagine, it is also in my present. Just because I'm there and, and at the game and, and helping with their homework, is your mind somewhere else because you're trying to think of a million other things that you also need to get done. And I think, so I imagine that, a lot of the same dilemmas we're talking about today, they're the same back then. And although what's so interesting talking to book clubs too about this book is very often they'll bring up, well, women back then in the 1930s, what choices they had, et cetera. And I think, and how strong that Lily becomes in the book from, it's a different Lily at the end of the story than it is at the beginning, right? I think her choices, speaking of, the choices that she makes for comfort and safety, the choices that she makes at the end of the story is because she has changed, that she has grown by the end and become a stronger person. So her choices change because of those experiences in a short amount of time. But I think that what was I going to say? I kind of went on a few topics. Sorry. This is the mom in me, right? I'm like thinking,
being present is where you started with that.
Yeah. But as far as Lily goes, what's interesting, talking to book clubs, they talk about the women back then. And I think what's so interesting, aside from motherhood, is that women were also strong back then. And so I think that there's not a big difference in that way too. And you think if you think of women in the stereotype of how we think of women in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, how do you think we got the vote? There were women that were suffragettes that risked everything, that were beaten in the streets, that were arrested on a regular basis. The reason we have a lot of what we have today and careers and everything else is because there were such strong women that stood up and broke the mold of what they were supposed to be, which I love. And I think that completely parallels with today.
Absolutely, which we're still doing as women, even today, to enter every different walk of life and have a voice. And like any minority, I think women were a minority for a very long time. And I love that. And I think there's no better story than someone who can write a story that shows a character's growth and change, like you did, because we can relate to that character, and we can find hope in that and see them overcoming all sorts of obstacles and still getting stronger instead of weaker. It's just a great example. And that's another reason why we love fiction. Absolutely. Thank you for that story.
You're welcome.
There's a last relatable theme that I thought we should talk about because I thought this one was very prevalent. And it's this idea of sometimes when we make choices and there's a lot of unintended consequences, we agonize over those mistakes. And sometimes we carry those forward with us, right? We are agonizing so much that we don't even make better choices going forward. And I thought that was a really interesting theme that emerged. And I was just wondering, how do we confront our past choices and go forward and with clarity? Do you have some thoughts on that? Because your characters really wrestled with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And gosh, don't we all, especially as parents, right?
Yes.
Should have done that, should have done that. And I don't know about you, but I'm definitely one that can hang on to a mistake or something I said, that I think, oh gosh, like did I didn't mean to say it that way. Did they take it the wrong way? And to obsess over it. And it's so interesting how you can circle back to somebody later and they don't even remember that you said it.
That's right.
And they were like, when did you say that? And you think, oh my gosh. And yet I wrestled with it for so long, feeling horrible that they might've taken it wrong. And that is a great lesson, by the way. I think that I've tried to help impart with my kids. They've definitely figured that out themselves as well, that coming home and thinking, oh my gosh, I think that, I acted so stupid when I did this. And then realizing soon after that the kids around them, especially boys, right? Like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting how much that we sometimes hold on to things that other people kind of brushed off or it was not as important to them. But that being said, I think that with important choices, with guilt that we wrestle with, I think it's not healthy to sit in it, anything that negative for a long period of time. I don't know if you've seen the movie Bridge of Spies, but there was a great which I highly recommend. It's a great movie. But there was a line there that said something about, like that he was imprisoned and up for trial and for being a spy. And I think Tom Hanks said something to the effect of, aren't you panicked? Aren't you worried? Because he seemed so calm. And he said, would it help? And I thought our whole family laughed at that because there's so much truth in that. And you think, okay, the situation's the same, whether I sit there and worry about it or dwell on the past, the choices are still ahead of me. So I think you can learn from it and take, the best that you can, just like we talked about, our parents are not perfect. So you try to take the best of them, you hope you pass on the best to your kids, and lose the not so great stuff. But I think that, learning from our past is super important. Otherwise we don't grow. But the rest of it, if it doesn't help, then, learning from it is great and moving on. But unless, I don't know that you're hanging on to it for anybody else except yourself. I don't think that benefits anyone else around you.
Very well put.
So true.
I always think in terms of every day trying to do better. And that's a really good way, maybe not to agonize on the past. Those were wise words.
Very much so. I have 2 kids, a son-in-law, a possible future daughter-in-law, 28 nieces and nephews. And someone said some wise words to me. I think I've already mentioned it on a podcast, but someone said to me when I was a young mother, if you are worried about whether you're a good mom, you're already a good mom.
I love that. It's kind of like when someone's crazy, right? If you're questioning whether or not you're crazy, you probably not. Because crazy people don't think they're crazy.
So true. Let's hope that's true too.
I hope so.
So what is next up on the radar for you? Are you working on a new book, or can you give us any clues about what's coming up next?
I love to. I finally can talk about it, which I'm so excited. It took a year longer than I planned. It's the longest amount of time I've ever spent on a book. So it took 2 years because apparently we had some things going on in the world for the last couple of years, but also it turned out to be the most complicated, the most research heavy book that I've ever done. It was enough research for at least 3 or 4 novels. It's a good thing, as I'm sure we all agree. Just like anything big and successful, like that you've all done in your lives, you realize if you had known what you were getting yourself into, you would have run screaming the other way in the beginning, right? So there's a blissful ignorance that is a huge benefit at times. And in this case, the novel that is finally coming out, I'm so excited, in September. So September 6th is called The Ways We Hide. And in short, it is about a female illusionist who is trying to recover from a childhood trauma, which, as we know from Sold on a Monday, so much of how we act now is based on something that happened in our lives very often as kids. And because of that, there's a true real life tragedy that happened in Michigan that I won't go into right now, but she becomes obsessed with escape because she was a survivor. And that's how she gets into illusions and escape. And because of her special skill set, she's recruited into British intelligence, a group called MI9. And we've all heard of MI5, MI6. Yes. You can imagine, you go, oh my gosh, it goes higher. Well, you figure the higher it goes, and we've never heard of them, there's probably a reason. So it's amazing. In short, MI9 was the go-go gadget team of British intelligence. So a lot of kind of things that they did got pulled into 007, the character known as Q. From there, she gets pulled much farther into the war than she ever expects. So I'll leave you that. And I will say, I do have, I'll mention very briefly, one other novel is a collaborative novel that I had to write in the midst of that. And that is coming out in October. And it's called When We Had Wings, because it's about what was called the Angels of Baton. And they were the nurses that served in the Philippines. And incredibly, there were over 80 of them. They were held prisoner by the Japanese for 3 years, and yet every single one of them survived. And so I wrote that with Susan Meisner and Ariel Lahan. HarperCollins had approached us and asked us to write the book, and the three of us are already friends. So it sounded like the literary version of Ocean's 11. We get to play and work at the same time, and it sounded like fun. So that's coming out in the fall.
Both of those sound fascinating. I know our listeners are going to want to wait for those and pick those up. And I know Kristen and I are going to be on that right away. And I hope you'll rejoin us after that comes out and we can talk about one of these other books. I can't wait to dive into that. Thank you so much. So it was a pleasure having you. For our listeners, you're going to want to connect with Kristina McMorris to find out about these new books. You're going to want to read Sold on a Monday. You are going to love it. Trust Kristen and I. Life-changing story. To connect with Kristina, visit her on her website, www.kristinamcmorris.com. You can also find her on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us. What a pleasure. Really, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. Thank you for all the cheering. You've absolutely made me.
Thank you for your beautiful writing and your heartfelt story.
Thank you. Take care, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, I can't wait for these new books coming out. That just sounds so incredible, doesn't it?
The first thing I thought of as she described the first one is a movie.
Yes.
I can see that immediately being a movie.
Absolutely. This is the fun of this podcasting job, is that we read every book, of course, and very carefully handpick authors to come on our show that are life-changing stories. And that is the most wonderful part about this job. We get to read all these books and then discuss them. So you touched on sort of an interesting thing I'd like to talk about a little more. You just talked a little bit about the difference in living during the Depression compared to the days that we're in now. And our grandparents, we still have a generation living who survived the Depression.
Yes.
So we have some firsthand stories of what it was like back then. It wasn't really that long ago. And what are some of your stories? Did you have anything that your grandparents have shared with you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I see a lot of who they were as being shaped by the times, by the Depression. You know, for example, with all of my grandparents, they didn't waste anything. You know, if there was food left over, you better believe it was in the next day's meal and it was delicious.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, conserving food and stretching every dollar, really important. Mm-hmm. I remember my nanny, once she took some tinfoil off of a pizza she was making, and she was a master at making pizza, let me tell you. But I remember she washed the tinfoil and folded it up after it dried and put it away for the next use. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, I'm thinking, why would you ever do that? It's something disposable. Now I look at that differently, of course, but that was because during the Depression, they were so focused on stretching every resource.
Mm-hmm. And not only that, I remember my grandmother sewing all of her clothes, and I remember her not buying new fabric, but taking old dresses and putting them together. And I think that sensation of having very little in conserving probably is one of these things that even Kristina said stays with you from your childhood into forever, and in subtle ways is even passed down to your children and grandchildren.
Oh, yeah.
Things that we remember, or think twice about throwing something out,
Yes.
or, you know, we recycle. It's very important to this generation.
Yes.
And this is passed down, I think, from the knowing what it's like to struggle in difficult times, just like during COVID.
Yeah, in fact, the importance of a garden. You know,
Yes.
that was because my grandparents were always thinking in terms of like a victory garden,
Mm-hmm,
and
victory
having
garden.
some means to sustain people in difficult times.
Mm-hmm.
But look at how all of those values go back to very important values anyway, of conservation of resources, of, you know, growing our own food. I just think there's so many beautiful things that we can learn.
I love that. I love this part. I just adored this book and everything of it. Something else that you touched on your last question that I'd love to just talk about a little bit more is this notion of guilt that you brought up, and that people, if we do something wrong, and we all do, if we act cruel, we have an act of unkindness, or maybe worse, maybe someone has committed a crime, and sometimes in our inner mind, we tell ourselves, nothing can go right now from here on in. I did something wrong, and so I'm going to be punished, and everything I do from here on out is not going to go well for me. Yeah. I don't believe this. I think it's illogical. I think it's superstitious. I do believe that wrong does have direct consequences, but I feel like sometimes the only one that carries this guilt into ruining their future lives is our own self.
Yeah.
And at some point, like you and Christina had discussed, we have to release ourselves from that. And we have to say, okay, I made a mistake. I did something wrong. I have turned from it. I am going to be different, whatever it is. This could go through a myriad of different things. And use it to learn and grow. Yeah. And not relish in it. Not stay down in there.
Yeah.
Have you experienced that in any way?
Oh, absolutely. I love what you just said. It made me think in terms of not being defined by your mistake.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Right? You want to grow in spite of your mistake, but if you allow those things to define you, that defeatist mentality really infects everything you do going forward. And I have been guilty of it. There are things that I've agonized over. Why did I ever do that? Okay, you did. Right? I have to step back and say to myself, okay, that doesn't define me. I'm going to now think in terms of my core identity and doing better the next time. And especially, as a parent of 4, trust me, I've made tons and tons of mistakes throughout my life. And I always keep going back to who the core of who I am, my identity, and not letting that overshadow it. I think that's also where having wise people in your life is also very important, who can remind you, this is who you are. These are things that you have accomplished and done. And we talk sometimes about mentors. We've talked about this in the past on other podcasts. But having somebody in your life that you trust their judgment, I think that's incredibly helpful, especially as you're wrestling with guilt.
Hugely. And yes, I love what you said about that. Sometimes I think that if you're struggling with this idea of guilt, or, I wish, as you age, you have more of it. You say to yourself, I wish I would have chosen A instead of B. I wish I wouldn't have said this. I wish I would have gone to this school instead. Why did I join that group? All kinds of things that you could have chosen differently. But I like to look at it as, show me one person who hasn't made a mistake. Show me one. And that's just who we are. And I guess it's what you do with that mistake. You say, hey, I'm going to embrace it. Okay, I did. Okay, but I learned from it. And I'm never going back there. Yeah. And I think we may have touched upon this before, that when you do experience something like that, you can really help somebody else who's going through it. Because I can say all day long, I understand what you're going through, to someone who's hurting for something. And they could say to me, well, yeah, Chris, thank you for saying that, but you really don't understand. Unless I have experienced it and felt that same pain or sorrow and tried to grow out of it. It almost could be insulting for me to say, I understand what you're going through. So we can use it. We can take it and we can use it. Help each other, become something better. And that's what this book was all about, was surviving mistakes and making different turns and changing your life around. Just loved it.
Yeah. Now, you had asked Christina what was on her radar. So I'm going to ask you, what's on your radar? What are you thinking about?
I'll tell you, I am super looking forward to these next 2 books she's written. That's on my radar. And I'm going to just leave. I like to take a little something out of every book I've read. And I think out of this book, the main thing that I'm taking is this notion of take a look at somebody. Don't decide whether you like them or you don't like them just because of one little snippet or one photo or one thing they said or one thing you heard about them. And really understand that, be careful who we think we're going to judge unless we've walked every day in their shoes. Yeah. And I like that about this book, because these characters took on so many different paths and became such complex creatures that changed and grew, that it really made me realize, wow, we are such a compilation of so many experiences and people we come in contact with, and emotions and tragedies and celebrations, and we're such a complex creature. And maybe we just need to cut each other a little break. How about you? What's on your radar?
Well, this book really showed me how important historical context is, but it also relates to understanding. Like, I feel like we understand things better now because of history. And I love the thought of not only learning so we don't repeat the mistakes people have made throughout history, but also understanding context. And I think it ties in with what you were just talking about in terms of empathy. We can show empathy, we can demonstrate empathy, we can experience it because we're looking at the context and we're putting ourselves in their shoes. So there's a lot there. She had a lot of good words of wisdom along those lines.
That's a great point, that whole historical learning from history. That's why we love, a lot of our books are historical fiction. We love every genre, but there's something special about historical.
Agreed.
So we spoke a lot today about child abuse, and Kristen and I cannot leave you without saying to you, if you suspect any kind of child abuse in your circle, or someone that you know, or a child in your area, please do report it. You can contact your local child protective agency, or you can even call the Child Help National Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4A-CHILD.
We're leaving you with a few storm predictions to pique your interest, or maybe you'd like to read ahead. We'll be interviewing Samantha Green Woodruff and her intriguing story, The Lobotomist's Wife. We have Laura Morelli and the brilliant tale, The Stolen Lady. We're having Teresa Ann Fowler and her amazing story, It All Comes Down to This. And Adriana Trajani with the heartfelt story, The Good Left Undone. In the meantime, stay on the radar with Kristen and me by visiting our website at bookstormpodcast.com. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And if you'd like to see us in person, or better yet, one of our amazing authors, you can view the video portion of this podcast on YouTube.
And as a side note, almost all 50 states we have a listener, including Hawaii. We have listeners in Japan and Germany, Argentina, and Australia. Until next time, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.